Over the past year and a half, I've played a lot of ROM hacks for the channel. Since I typically have my review in mind during my initial playthrough, I try to pick out one or two key elements of the game that I think would serve as a selling point for any potential audience. Stuff like the personal weapons and increased difficulty of 4 Kings, the unit structure and comedy of Burger King, or the map design of Call of the Armor. However, if I were to try to sell someone on Blessed Hearts, rather than pointing to any one specific concrete element, I would instead tell them about how I felt while playing through this Sacred Stones-inspired hack. During my blind playthrough, despite the fact that I had not played or seen these levels before, I felt a comfortable sense of familiarity. That's not to say that these maps were taken from or even similar to mainline Fire Emblem maps. They're all wholly original, and I would categorize them as significantly better than vanilla Fire Emblem maps. And mechanically, Blessed Heart also makes a number of significant departures from the GBA games. It has universal infantry shove, a completely rebalanced class system that incorporates in the plus and minus 50% breaker skills, and significant overhauls to the way that the bow weapon works. Even some fundamental Fire Emblem principles have been turned on their head, such as giving you an unpromoted axe fighter Jaken, who is one of the more interesting takes on the archetype I've seen. In fact, in some ways this game is a much bigger departure from vanilla than other games I've featured on the channel, like Call of the Armor and Iron Emblem. So how then does it manage to worm its way into the category of comfort game? Well, I can't say for certain, but I do have a theory. I think it's a combination of the game hitting the perfect sweet spot for difficulty, by my estimation falling somewhere in between FE6 and FE7, while also maintaining a very brisk pace, both from a story and map design standpoint. Cutscenes convey enough information to keep the plot moving along, as well as getting me invested in the various characters in the cast, but didn't overstay their welcome, so I always felt like I had something to do. And this held true while playing through the maps as well. I typically found myself spending between 3 and 10 turns on each map, and none of them felt like downer turns. Downer turns is the term that I use for turns where all you're doing is moving your units through a hallway or across a field, with maybe one round of combat to occupy your time. In Blessed Heart, however, I felt like every single one of my units needed to either land an attack or perform a healing action with every single one of their turns. This is because the game's designer, Shark3143, made economic use of these smaller spaces on the maps in this game's campaign. There's neither wasted space nor wasted time, and things just kept moving at a brisk pace, in part because of the lack of difficulty. While the combat is not as brainless as something like Sacred Stones or Fire Emblem 7 Eliwood mode, it also doesn't have the extreme challenges that are often found when you crank the difficulty up in modern Fire Emblem games or ROM hacks. Like I said, I would consider this game to be slightly easier than Fire Emblem 6 hard mode, meaning that I could often pilot my way through a group of enemies based on feel rather than calcing up the numbers. I did, however, still have to be quite proactive in my choices because this game focuses very heavily on offense over defense, both in its unit and enemy design philosophy. Throughout the early and mid-game, most of my units could only take 1 or 2 hits from enemies, and the incredibly frail ones ended up getting one-rounded by everything as we moved into the late game. But for the most part, a similar thing was true of the enemies. My strongest units could be routinely relied on to one-round about 75% of my foes, and if I needed help on the extra tough ones, they could team up with a buddy and usually take them down in 2 or 3 combats. This places a heavy emphasis on taking care of business on player phase, but also allows the game's few armor knights to shine because their defensive bulk is genuinely valuable and quite rare. And because the game has a number of timed side objectives as well as a handful of hard-timed main objectives, you're going to want at least one member of your team who you can overextend without worrying about them dying. Overall, because of the lower time commitment, reasonable difficulty, and incredibly smooth gameplay, I think Blessed Heart is a great recommendation for Fire Emblem fans who haven't yet gotten into ROM hacking or have only barely dipped their toes into the water. But I think it is worth caveating that recommendation by diving into some of the more extreme changes that Blessed Heart makes to the Fire Emblem formula. And I'll start by addressing the most controversial systems change. I've mentioned this a few times before, but I'm really not a fan of when games, or especially hacks, give bows 1-2 range. Personally, I feel swords being locked to 1 range and bows being locked to 2 or 3 range gives the weapons some amount of flavor. It makes them feel distinct from the other physical weapons. While might and hit can alter slightly between lances and axes, I always felt like as long as everything has access to 1-2 range, weapons end up feeling quite homogeneous. And I don't like that. As such, upon learning that Blessed Hearts had given 1-2 range to not only short bows, but every single bow in the game, I was a little bit turned off. And when I checked statistics and realized that the iron bow is just a strict upgrade over the javelin, I was incredibly confused. It seemed pretty clear that bows were strictly the best weapon type, with perpetual 1-2 range and effective damage against flyers. And like, there's nothing wrong with there being a best weapon type or best class in Fire Emblem. I don't think balance is an inherently good aspect of the game, but it was a little bit weird to me, and I was wondering where the design philosophy came from. Well, after playing for a little bit, I can say that I think 1-2 range bows actually really work in this setting. They felt quite similar to hidden weapons from the Fates games, in that their perpetual 1-2 range has the trade-off of being lower might than the lances and axes, albeit they are tied with swords, which kind of makes swords feel bad. Moreover, the native bow users have pretty abysmal stats to balance out the fact that they gain access to the best weapon type. I thought it was a really neat push-pull, and while I did end up giving the majority of my units bow access, I don't think the 1-2 range bows are as inherently unbalanced as they appear at first glance, and honestly, I quite like their design. It also feeds into this game's new branch promotions. Many classes have the option to gain bows on promotion, and if they do so, they gain lower statistical advantages than they do if they went to the other path. I usually still went with the bow class because bows were pretty awesome in this game, but I think it presents interesting choices, and interesting choices is kind of what Fire Emblem is all about. Not every branching promo involved choosing stats versus bows, however. There are 3 classes that get breaker skills. Swordmaster has Axe Breaker, Halberdier has Sword Breaker, and Warrior has Lance Breaker. Given that Warrior maintains bow access, this means that the Warrior promotion path is one of the most tempting ones for the units who have access to it, giving them plus 50 hit and avoid versus Lance users as well as perpetual 1-2 range. But much like in Sacred Stones, the units who have Warrior access actually struggle with their speed stat, and while I did still send both of them into Warrior to make use of that class's toolkit, I found that both of these fighters ended up getting doubled towards the late mid-game as they just couldn't meet the speed thresholds I wanted them to. The fact that Hero could have helped avoid that situation makes a compelling argument for the choice being more balanced than it initially seems. I guess my point is that if you, like me, are hesitant about the efficacy of 1-2 range bows, go into Blessed Hearts with an open mind. 1-2 range bows still aren't my favorite feature of Romhacks, but I do think that this game pulls them off in a superb manner. It wouldn't be a complete review if I didn't talk about the story of Blark, and I quite enjoyed it. I wouldn't say it's Shakespeare or anything, but it is a good deal better than most vanilla Fire Emblem stories. Which, like, yes, that is a low bar, but that is also a low bar that a lot of ROM hacks don't manage to reach. The plot involves members of noble bloodlines, who are recognizable based on their eye colors not matching their hair color, being abducted by a dark cult who plans to do something evil. The main character, Erin, rushes into danger to save her parents and later her brother, and is constantly recklessly rushing into danger without a second thought. The story thematically mirrors her attitude by getting to the action quickly. In this way, it mirrors the gameplay. I complimented the maps based on the fact that there's not really any downer turns, and in the same way, the story doesn't really have any downtime. It's constantly moving, but in a way that doesn't feel forced. It feels appropriate for events to continue to happen at the pace that they do. The story doesn't waste your time is what I'm saying. Which, to be frank, is a lesson that the overly verbose Fire Emblems on the Switch could stand to learn. But despite the story not overstaying its welcome, the world feels incredibly fleshed out, with lore that has had a lot of thought put into it, with things like the countries, their alliances, the way that magic works, and even race being expanded upon in the main story and the supports. Speaking of race, one of the things that I found to be a selling point was the large number of non-white characters in the cast. Your party predominantly consists of black, brown, and tan characters, with a few token Caucasian characters. Even generic units are dark-skinned. And I think representation is important. It's good that there is a Romhack out here that reflects the wide swath of human skin tones. And look, I know that there are going to be some people that are upset that I even bring this up, and if you fall into that group, then I unkindly invite you to play one of the dozens of Fire Emblem games that doesn't have a single dark-skinned character, or the ones that have one or two token dark-skinned characters but still a predominantly white cast. Or any of the hacks that don't have any dark-skinned characters, or any of the hacks that have one or two token dark-skinned characters. My point is that if you are upset that this game doesn't have enough white people, you are spoiled for picking. Just go play another one, it's fine. Also, don't let the door hit you on the way out. But for everyone who's not unreasonably upset about a healthy amount of melanin in this ROM hack, I would definitely recommend Blart as a very good beginner hack. Both in terms of its difficulty, which felt a little bit harder than FE7, and in terms of its feel, because it's not incredibly experimental. Despite the overhauls made to bows and the addition of some breaker skills, this isn't all that dissimilar from something that Intelligent Systems would have pumped out during the GBA GameCube Wii era. But the fact that it is of a noticeably higher quality than the official Fire Emblem games, I think gives a good impression of what you are in for in the wonderful world of ROM hacking. And if you're a veteran to the hack scene, I think that Blart would be enjoyable for you as well. I breezed through it in the course of a week, playing a couple of maps at a time, in between editing videos and recording audio. And I think you could easily get through it much faster if you just devoted your entire time to the playthrough. With a low time commitment, enjoyable story, and good gameplay, I think this is absolutely worth checking out. As is this game's creator's YouTube channel. Shark, some string of numbers that I can never remember, makes videos on Fire Emblem as well. So if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to them. That way you end up with more awesome videos on your homepage. And I can't really think of a good transition, so I'm just going to thank the patrons out of the blue. Thank you to Michael Kraus, Len, Gameboo, Carosa, Fyrant, Smaz Ruby, Saxon, Reflect, Marin McLean, Calamity Kelly, Queen Eliza, Adele, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Danielle Kalaskis, Jagan is an Est, Arvis, Bell Wenska, Die Psych, Tailored Muffin, George Granville the 7th PM, SUP, Caius Cole, Gabe the Green, Control Aegis, Joanna the Wrenchwitch, Juniper Junby, Ginger, and especially my Jagans, Autumn Kelsey and Julia Kyoto. And Kirison873, who joined the Jagans tier while I was editing this video. If you're interested in supporting the channel, there is a link to my Patreon below. It includes benefits like early videos, votes that influence the channel, and some stuff that's a bit too spicy to talk about on YouTube. But please only subscribe to the Patreon if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want anyone going broke over Fire Emblem content. If you're looking for free ways to help out, the like and subscribe buttons are right down there, and comment below what hacks you think I should check out next. I'm always looking for suggestions, and there's just so many that I haven't even heard of. But regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.